Hey guys, Fiore Sorecci here, professor of writing and literature, and occasionally I will teach a class in the philosophy of enlightenment. I've taught things on social history, really fun talking about representations of poverty through the ages. I've taught a lot of different things, but these days I'm teaching lots of writing, and I'm kind of going through this process of looking through a lot of my old books, things that I've read that have been inspiring to me, and I take tons of notes. And the message never gets out, or I never really feel like I'm getting to say everything I want to say about them. So um, hopefully this video will reach you, will make some kind of sense, will open up a dialogue about some of these interesting books from the 18th century. So today I'm going to choose not a book, actually, but an essay written by Samuel Johnson. So Samuel Johnson, if you don't know, is sometimes called the first man of letters, right? The first person to think about literature as a profession. In other words, not just writing texts, novels, and poems, but also the profession of talking about literature, teaching literature, opening people's eyes to the study of it. And so he's called Dr. Johnson. Interesting how if you say Dr. Johnson to anyone who studies the 18th century, they'll know who it is, even though thousands of people called Johnson, but they know who that guy is. So he's an amazing writer. He kind of comes off as a curmudgeon, as a kind of a grouchy dude. If you look at a picture of him, an image of him, he's kind of grouchy looking. And so you get this idea of, the first kind of, ill-humored critic. And he is a critic, but the irony is he's not the critic, that kind of stereotype critic of a guy who's not satisfied with anything. He is very discerning. He's an older classical kind of critic, which to me means a person who opens up light, sheds light on texts so you can think about them. And that's what's inspiring for me, because I really love that idea, not of criticizing a text or evaluating, giving it stars and reviews, which is also good, but kind of like opening up conversation about it, right? And this is another way to look at text. There's a lot of book clubs do this. So this is what I like about Johnson. And the thing about Johnson is that his language is so it's beautiful, it's concise, and yet there's a kind of, you just gotta take a look and see what you think. So we're gonna take a look at one of his essays. Now he wrote a series of essays in a magazine which he called the Rambler. And so they're just numbered. It's like Rambler number 1, Rambler number 2. And I'm going to just read through one of them because, I kind of went back and forth. Oh man, should I like organize this, do fancy stuff on After Effects and things? And I can do that stuff. But then I spend 7 hours on After Effects and only a little bit on actually thinking and talking about the book. So hopefully you guys will enjoy this. Let's take a look. Let's just take a look and see how it goes, right? So here is Rambler number 25. And I'm just using the old font, which I love because I like to think about, this is actually how it was printed at that time in the 18th century. This is 1752, the printing, it was written in 1750. And the reason I love it is because I don't know if you guys have ever seen a type box where they have the little metal letters that people used to put arranged together on these wooden boxes, and then they used to use the press on that and impress the page on that. And so here, the idea that every single word has been laid down by an apprentice or a little boy who works in the printers, or sometimes professional printers do that, and every single one. The irony of this, the beauty of this typesetting idea here is that, surprisingly, if I take a look, I also do some proofreading. So if I take a look at a text, right, a text that's been published, recently. Here's a text Thinking Fast and Slow. It's published by Penguin, right? I will find more typos in a modern text than I will find in these old texts that were where they could not like delete and they were set by hand, made of lead, and somehow these older texts, I don't know how they did it, but I have to go back and study some of my history of the book studies. They had many fewer errors in spelling and spacing and all kinds of stuff. Amazing, just amazing. So I just love the look of it. I love the smudgy look. It's just beautiful. So he starts out like a lot of people did in the 18th century by having a Latin epigram, right? Or epigraph, I think it's called. So something that started off to kick it off. And here it's possunt quia posse videntur. Now I wish I spoke Latin, but I did look up the meaning of this, and it basically means those who think they can win are the ones who actually win, right? So it's the question of confidence and whether you sometimes can sabotage yourself before you do something. You think you're not going to be good at it, and lo and behold, you do fail at it. You say, see, I knew I was going to fail. Self-fulfilling prophecy. But the opposite, the converse can be true, that if you go into something with a certain type of confidence, you have a greater chance of success. And that's his topic, right? That's the topic. And of course, it's by Virgil, and Virgil is one of the great idols and heroes of the 18th century. Amazing thing about the 18th century, if you guys are interested in this, is that, well, if you're listening to my video this far, you are interested in this, is that they brought back a taste for classical writers. Virgil is a Roman writer, and they often quote Greek writers, although the 18th century Brits were more into the Roman writers than the Greek writers. They're not big, you don't see Plato quoted everywhere, although he is everywhere, right? Aristotle is even more ubiquitous. But Virgil, he's an epic writer. He wrote the Aeneid. He wrote many poems. He wrote about literature as well. And so this is a part of the 18th century that's also kind of cool. You can see it in dollar bills, American iconography, American architecture that's from, the revolutionary times, a kind of a idolization of the Roman culture, right? The architecture of the Capitol building, the iconography of the dollar bill with the eagle and things like that. So it starts out with this Roman thing. And he says, there are some vices and errors. And please, this is one of I told you about how I like the typeface, but you have to get used to a couple things. The F sometimes looks like that. And then you'll see later on there's a thing that looks like an S that's not an S. We'll see. We'll get here. Oh, here it goes. Here. I mean, it looks like an F, but it's actually an S. So here's the universal. Here is some, right? The letter S represented as an F. I don't know why they did that. I used to think it's because they couldn't get the S to space out, but here's the S here, and it's spacing out just perfectly. So anyway, that's just one of the peccadillos of 18th century writing, 18th century printing. There are some vices and errors which, though often fatal to those in whom they are found, have yet, by the universal consent of mankind, been considered as entitled to some degree of respect. Okay, so here, I'm not even going to go through this gigantic first sentence because he writes huge sentences, but the sentences of Johnson are superbly balanced, beautiful balance in his clauses, if that's something that you've ever thought about. So there are vices, let's just say vices and errors, right? So there are things people do poorly, or bad habits, although some of them are fatal, right? You can have a bad habit and you can die from that, right? So you have an addiction, right? And in the age of Shakespeare, this is also the age of the rediscovery of Shakespeare, the fatal flaw, right? And yet, even though we have these dangerous vices, some of these vices gather some respect. So there are some human flaws that are respectable, not respectable, but respected, right? Or at least been exempted from contemptuous infamy and condemned by the severest moralists with pity rather than detestation. So he's kind of softening you up to get you ready to look at maybe there are certain bad habits that have some redeeming qualities to them, right? So that's how he starts. And this whole set, I'm sorry, guys, that blab on and on. We haven't even gotten past the first sentence, but this whole idea of this shorter form, you'll see it's only a few pages, and opening up with this question of errors, vices. This is very classic. It goes back to at least as far as Bacon, and probably further back, Francis Bacon around the time of Shakespeare. That would be 150 years before this. And so it's got this classic feel to it. I'm going to write an essay. I'm going to find this thing that everybody does that's deplorable or questionable, and I'm going to open a deeper discussion into it. So as I told you in the beginning, that Johnson is known as the first kind of illuminator of literature, as a profession. Here he's going to be illuminating a point of morality, not a point of literature. But there's a lot of intertwined things here about literature. And especially at the end, there's a beautiful little notion about teaching. I'm a teacher, and I love good teaching. I love observing good teaching. I love being around people who are dedicated to the craft. And so he has a little insight there towards the end. So a constant and invariable example of this partiality we find in the different treatment received by rashness and cowardice, right? So we have rashness and we have cowardice. We have a person who's impetuous, who rushes in, who's adventurous, very risk-taking, maybe reckless. And you have another person who's afraid of everything. So one of these qualities, as you can already guess, is praised, even though it's excessive. And one of these qualities is never praised, is always looked down upon, right? Of which, though they may be conceived equally distant from the middle point where true fortitude is placed, and may equally injure any public or private interest, yet the one is never mentioned without some kind of veneration. So they're both flaws, right? Being reckless and crazy, rushing in, and being a coward, right? Cowardly and afraid of everything. But he says, and preferably you want to be at the middle point, as he says. That's where true fortitude is. But one of them always attracts us a little bit more, right? And you could basically think about why Tom Cruise movies, for better or for worse, I don't know your taste, are popular, right? They sell a lot of movies. The Mission Impossible deal, right? So, and the other always considered as a topic of unlimited and licentious censure, right? Beautiful, unlimited. So cowardice is always licentiously censured, right? So licentious, if you don't know what it means, if you look in a dictionary, it might mean immoral, some kind of immorality. But here, what by licentious he means, you can indulge yourself in totally bashing the coward. Just indulge yourself because everybody does it, right? Cowards are universally despised, right? At least in this kind of classic formation of the character, right? I mean, of course, if you know somebody that's scared, right? You're a parent, your kid is scared of something, you are scared of something, and you have a friend, and you're like, I have to admit to you, I don't like jumping off the diving board. It kind of freaks me out. You're not going to say, oh, you dumb coward, vigliacco, as they say in Italian, terrible. Of course you're going to be so. And I'm sure Johnson was like that too. But here he's talking about the characters, right? Because he's really talking theoretically about when we form a character, say in a novel or a drama, or in public life, in political life, the way we form ideas of certain characters, right? That's what he's really talking about, to just focus on that. And which all the virulence of reproach may be lawfully exerted. So, I'll look for a PDF of this, and you can have a lot of fun breaking down these sentences. The same distinction is made by the common suffrage between profusion and avarice, and perhaps between many other opposite vices, right? So we have cowardice and recklessness, and we also have whatever you call them, somebody just spends all their money. He's using the word profusion. And on the other hand, somebody's very cheap, avarice, right? So, he says there's a lot of binaries like this, right? As I have found reason to pay great regard to the voice of people, in most cases when knowledge has been forced upon them by experience without long deduction deep researches. I read this fast, but this is a really important point, guys. This is a super important point, and you'll see him contradicting himself. He won't say this all the time, you know, but you gotta pay attention when they do say stuff like this. So here it is. The distinction is made by common suffrage. Now, today the word suffrage means people who are allowed to vote, right? Or people who are legally permitted to vote, right? So people over all adults over the age of 18, right? So by suffrage, what he just means is the popular opinion, right? The voice of public opinion. So you would imagine a guy like Johnson, right? And this is a little stereotype of literary people, especially Dr. Johnson, right? To be a little suspicious of popular opinion, right? Say, well, we shouldn't go with that, right? Popular opinion has us, has Tom Cruise movies as popular, right? I brought that up before. If you're not into Tom Cruise movies, you might say, well, popular opinion isn't all isn't all that, right? Isn't all it's cracked up to be. But he's saying there is something wise in public opinion, right? And why is it wise? Not because we should follow the crowd, but because knowledge has been forced upon them by experience, right? So right here, I'm going to just highlight this again. One of these days, I'll figure out how to get this into a thicker thing. So knowledge has been forced upon them by experience. And people of knowledge through experience are not dummies, right? So a little backstory to Johnson is Johnson was really interested. I mean, Johnson had a lot of flaws, okay? If I told you what he said about women writers, forget it. But Johnson really was fascinated with the streets of London. This is an extremely dangerous time in London. Little known fact, you look back in the past and you watch movies on, Masterpiece Theater or whatever. And streets were rough, lots of gangs, very famous gang at that time called the Mohawks. And he was mugged a bunch of times. I don't think they call it mugging, but he was robbed a bunch of times. But he was fascinated with the streets. And like many, many writers of his time, he's interested in orphans and street people and prostitutes and pocket pickers. And a lot of novels were about these people. One of my favorite novels, Moll Flanders by Daniel Defoe. So he's not just saying this theoretically, like we have to pay attention to public opinion. He's not like, what's the dude in the New York Times who writes the economics article? Really great writer, Paul Krugman. But Paul Krugman is always talking on this high macro level, right? He's not. You might think Johnson's like that, but a lot of the British writers of the 18th century are not macro level. Are not macro level exclusively. They know the streets. Many of them have taken in orphans. Many of them have dealt with the plague and the gangs and all kinds of seedy aspects of London street life, right? These people are familiar with this stuff. So I just want to give you a background here because otherwise you look at Johnson, it's a long time ago. And, the tendency with these classic writers, is to give them all the same kind of like, Walt Disney, British, BBC kind of, these classic British know-it-all kind of people. It wasn't like that. It wasn't like that. Trust me. It was never like that. And so, if you were to look into the life of Walt Whitman, if you would look into the life of Edgar Allan Poe, of course, in the 20th century, great writers, of the 20th century, Toni Morrison, all kinds of people. These are people who lived, right? These are people who lived. And as soon as you raise them up into this level of like, demigod or, knowledge, these are extraordinary people, but they're also people who lived, right? So I encourage you guys to kind of, always look for those little cracks in between the lines where you can peek a little bit at things like, things like this. So this is long story short, he values public opinion. I am inclined to believe that this distribution of respect, however unequal, right? And another cool thing about 18th century printing is that they put the first word of the next page on the bottom of the page. And there's the word unequal. And it has disappeared because I have to go to my next volume. Give me a chance, guys. Just give me a minute. Okay, so where was I? I think I was on the bottom of a page somewhere. There we go. No, I don't want to run text recognition on this kind of typeset. All right, so why am I theorize is the thing. So anyway, I like to theorize. So, okay, so unequal as appear at first view is not without some agreement with the nature of things. Without some agreement with the nature of things, right? And that in the faults which are thus inverted with external pressure, there are generally some latent principles of merit. Okay. So here is the classic 18th century deal. This is actually a little bit piece of philosophy here. The public, as we said before this little break here, the public seem to agree that when you have these binaries, either greed or avarice, whether cowardice or recklessness, there are one side is preferred to the other. So even though both sides are bad, it's bad to be super greedy, it's bad to be super cheap, but one side, in a popular opinion, seems to take the preference. Now, in terms of recklessness and cowardice, definitely recklessness is preferable in the public opinion. So he says, there is some wisdom there, but why is it wise, right? Because it agrees with the nature of things. Now, this sounds a little, as they say, push polling in politics, right? Like he's just asserting this, right? This is the nature of things, that certain vices are better than others, right? That's it. But there is a philosophy behind it. And the philosophy is a very important philosophy in the 18th century, the idea of how vices become virtues, how things that you do that are bad or wrong actually become preferable things, powerful things, qualities that you want to have. Right? You don't just suddenly become wise or suddenly become balanced. Some people do have a disposition that is very balanced and strong, but you don't suddenly become that. You become that through a special kind of trial and error, right? So the idea is that vices can turn into virtues. So if you have something like recklessness and you learn from your recklessness, you're like, whoa, I can't be jumping off this rock into this pond because there's some submerged things in there. I knock my brains out. I'm lucky I didn't die. But through that experience, you start to get more cautious and you start to balance out courage, true courage from just craziness, right? And there's many, many other things like that, right? The desire to blab your brains out can become a great specialty. You can become a great lawyer, a great judge, right? A person who uses their desire to speak and be admired, and you tone down the part of it that's negative and bad, and then the part that's good grows into something great, right? So this is an 18th century concept that has many, many ramifications, many, many forms. Some people make a joke out of it, like Rousseau said, he just said, yeah, one thing turns into the other and it still sucks and it's still bad, right? That's what Rousseau's always like that. So he's like, what is geometry? What is geometry? Geometry is good? No, it's not. Geometry started as one person wanting to steal land from another person. So he figured out a way to measure land so that he can figure out how to steal what's not his, right? Right? That's how geometry started. So it started out bad and it's still used like that, right? So yeah, anyway, but the idea is that there is a value in admiring certain forms of admiring the extreme, because the extreme can eventually become something good. And that's which by degrees, so here it goes. Some possibilities of future virtues, which may by degrees break from obstruction and by time and opportunity be brought into act, right? So the future courage and, ability to work under fire, let's say, to be very courageous in battle when you need to be, things like that. It'll break through the crust of stupid ways of doing it, bad ways of doing it, and eventually it will be manifest in your actions, right? It may be laid down as an acknowledged axiom that it's more easy to take away superfluities than to supply defects, right? So what does this mean? It's easier to take away the extra stuff that you do rather than to build up from having a deficiency, right? So you have a quality. Here's the quality of courage, right? So there's either the lack of courage completely, right? We're talking about the first point again, or there's an excess, right? Of let's keep calling it courage. There's an excess of courage, right? So it's easier to whittle down your excess of courage to that middle point where it's true courage and it's wise courage than it is to be cowardly and try to build up your courage to the middle point. That's what he means. And therefore, he that is culpable because he has passed the middle point of virtue is always accounted a fair object of hope. In other words, there's more hope for the person who is excessive in things than the person who's deficient in things. Now, this again sounds arrogant and snobby and does not take into account the full scope and dimension of human experience, right? I'll just say that because, that's one of the problems with Samuel Johnson. These are, musings. These are musings about vice and virtue. But let's follow him and see how much we can agree with this. The one that has all that perfection requires and more, but the excess may be easily retrenched, right? You can take the excess and cut it away. The other wants the quality required to excellence. In other words, he's lacking the quality. And who can tell how he shall obtain it? Right? We are certain that the horse may be taught to keep pace with his fellows, whose fault is that he leaves them behind. Right? So a horse that runs too fast can be taught to go slower. Right? But can a horse who's gone slow his whole life learn to go faster? We know that a few strokes of the axe will lop a cedar. A beautiful little balanced little poetic phrase, lop a cedar. Beautiful. Yeah, it's Johnson's also a poet. But what arts of cultivation can elevate a shrub? What the heck is going on here? Beautiful. To walk with circumspection and steadiness in the right path at an equal distance between the extremes of error ought to be the constant endeavor of every reasonable being. So it's good that we have moderation. Nor can I think of those teachers of moral wisdom much to be honored as benefactors of mankind, who are always enlarging upon the difficulty of our duties and providing rather excuses for vice than incentives to virtue. What is he talking about? Let me break this down a minute. I might even have to pause to think about this. Let me just pause here because this is okay. So he's saying yes, it's good to have moderation and not be too reckless or too cowardly. Yeah, but he's saying, when you look at it that way, and this is the age of sermons, right? There's tons of sermons, right? There were, of course, people went to church every Sunday, and the minister's job, the Protestant minister's job, was to educate his flock, not just preach to them. And he's saying this is not the way to do it. You don't get to the middle point, to a really organic middle point, by always saying how hard it is to have a middle point, right? Right? He says it provides excuses for vice. You get discouraged when you think, wow, I've been a little too much, a little too little, a little too much. That's just discouraging. Because since to most it will happen, and to all sometimes, that there will be a deviation towards one side or the other, we ought always to employ our vigilance with most attention on that enemy from which there is greatest danger, and to stray. If we must stray towards those parts from whence it is probable we shall quickly and easily return. So rather than always check ourselves all the time, if we're going to make a mistake in one direction, let's make a mistake towards acting more rather than acting less, doing more rather than doing less, because it's easier to cut back from doing more than to build up from doing less. So this is just building up on his point. Among other opposite qualities of the mind, which may become dangerous, though in different degrees, I've often had occasion to consider the contrary effects of presumption. Okay, let's skip this, because this is once again making these binaries, and here he's describing the difference between excessive optimism and also pessimism. Beautiful stuff in there. I just want to kind of move ahead to concept of alternative. Okay, so here's a couple points I want to end with. One is about the specialization in literature, and one is about teaching. So there is often to be found in men devoted to literature a kind of intellectual cowardice, right? This is an amazing line, which whoever converses with among may observe frequently to depress the alacrity of exercise at enterprise, right? This is great. This is great. So depress the alacrity of enterprise. So alacrity means speed, and enterprise means project, things that you want to do. So what stops you from doing the things you want to do? What stops you from studying with joy, with full engagement? He says, what stops people from studying with full engagement? What retards the improvement of science? So in the 18th century, science meant knowledge. So what slows down the accumulation of knowledge is this notion that you can only know something in a specialized way. In other words, if you're a computer scientist, you can stick with that. If you're a mathematician, stick with that. So this idea of specialization slows people down. They have annexed to every species of knowledge some chimerical character of terror and inhibition, which they transmit without much reflection from one to the other. Da da da, da da da. One study is inconsistent with a lively imagination, another with a solid judgment, was improper in the early parts of life, another requires so much time. In other words, what he's saying is, if you're already prejudging different forms of knowledge, you're saying, well, if I study history, that's a little bit too many battles. If I study, social science, etc., and you're already closing yourself off from knowledge because you're kind of characterizing things in a specialized way. And so this is what men of literature do. And this is, as I teach in an English department, and actually, to think of it, nowadays people have a pretty broad and generous view of literature, right? But he's warning against prejudging areas of knowledge and giving things a chance, opening your mind to different things, different areas of knowledge. So that's there. But the real advantage that this is okay. Be open to different kinds of knowledge. You don't need a great book from 18th century to tell you that. But this part is where he really starts. Every kind of knowledge requires a particular genius. He says this is, of all the things you can say to people, this is the worst. That when people say, I can't study economics because I don't have a head for numbers, or I can't do that because of this. Okay, fine. You don't want to study economics because it's not your taste. Okay. But he says, give things a chance, because the idea that you are by nature not capable of, not drawn to certain things, this already blocks you from the world of knowledge. He calls it a bugbear. Bugbear is like you can look it up, and nowadays we might say boogeyman, right? So mental constitution framed for the reception of some ideas, exclusion of others. So he says, no, this is not the way to go. And, we have a word for people who study chemistry and also are great artists, right? People like that. We call them Renaissance men, Renaissance people, right? But in the 18th century is when they really encourage this kind of, Catholic view of the world, right? By Catholic, I mean the old meaning of Catholic, which means a broad, multidisciplinary view of the world. Maybe more than in the Renaissance itself. I mean, just because Da Vinci was a Renaissance, was a multitasker and polymath, I don't think many of the artists of that time were. But in the 18th century, you have people like Joseph Priestley, who was a great writer, a great preacher. He discovered oxygen. He was in favor of the French Revolution and wrote political works in favor of the American and French Revolution. And there are many people like this. So this is what he's encouraging. Okay, and then, keep going. So you don't need to have a particular genius for one type of thing in order to start studying it. And when he says genius, by the way, again, in the 18th century, the word genius doesn't mean genius like Isaac Newton. And they didn't actually even use the word genius for Isaac Newton, at least not always in that same way. It's the old meaning of genius, the old Latin root of genius, which means spirit, right? So you don't need a certain spirit or a certain soul to study a certain thing. You just need curiosity, right? And we'll end with this question about teaching. There is another species of false intelligence given by those who profess to show the way to the summit of knowledge. In other words, teachers. We claim that we're going to show, we're going to be the guide to the peak of knowledge. Right? You're going to climb the mountain with me and be very knowledgeable. So what do we do that's wrong? We do two things that are wrong, and both of those sides, both of those extremes are bad. Remember, he's been talking the whole time about extremes. Both of the extremes are bad. One of them depresses the mind, in other words, discourages people and makes people distrustful of themselves, right? The other weakens the mind, right? By solicitude. I don't know why the word dejection is there. I have to figure that out. But solicitude, it makes sense. In other words, I'll explain. I'll explain as we go, okay? When a scholar whom they desire to animate consults them at his entrance to some new study, it's common to make flattering representations of his pleasantness and facility, right? So when a scholar, here the word scholar means student. So when a student says, hey, I would really love to get into studying the novels of Jane Austen, right? And you're like, amazing, Jane Austen, incredible writer. You know, she took very complicated social situations and boiled them down into these lovely social interactions, mostly between men and women. And she put women in a position of agency, unlike a lot of other people. You definitely should read her novels. You're going to love them. He says, no, that's not the way to do it, because you're giving a false feeling that it's so easy to do, right? So what's wrong with that? Thus, they generally attain one of two ends, almost equally desirable. They either incite his industry by elevating his hopes, or produce a high opinion of their own abilities, since they are supposed to relate only what they have found, and proceed with no less ease than they promised to their followers, right? Okay, so he says, teachers think, right, that they are getting two things that are desirable, two ends, two goals. Either they incite his industry, in other words, they motivate the student, right, to be industrious, or they produce a high opinion of their own abilities, right? So the teacher himself becomes greater because the student will say, wow, he really knows a lot about this stuff, right? What happens then? The student, inflamed by this encouragement, sets forward in the new path and proceeds a few steps with great alacrity. So he starts out great, makes a lot of progress the first couple of weeks, but he soon finds asperities, difficulties, intricacies, complexities, of which he has not been forewarned, and imagining that none ever was so entangled and fatigued before him, sinks suddenly into despair. So he has not been forewarned of how difficult it is to read Jane Austen, right? I mean, some of you guys can just read it right off, but not everything worth doing is easy to do from beginning to end, as you guys know, right? If you're learning to code and learn Python, as I am, oh my God, you know. So what happens is they think that no one before them were ever so entangled, right? Nobody ever had a problem reading Jane Austen before. And so because the professor gave them the idea that it's so easy, so it's because he's a professor, supposedly has experience with a lot of other students. Because of that, okay, probably it's going to be great. And if I'm having problems, I must be the first one. And that is a horrible feeling. And you're the only one. You're the big dummy that's the only one who can't read Jane Austen. You know, somebody says, wow, you really got to read Macbeth. It's the easiest of all Shakespeare plays. It's so clear, it's powerful, and you read it, you can't get past the first page. I know that feeling. Oh my God, that must be me. And he desists, gives up. Thus his terrors are multiplied by his hopes. Things that he's afraid of originate as hopes. and he's defeated without resistance because he has no expectation of an enemy. He's surprised by the difficulty. Right? Of these treacherous instructors, the one destroys industry by declaring that industry is vain, others by representing it as needless. The one cuts away the root of hope, the other raises it only to be blasted. Right? So here are two different instructors. And if I didn't catch this before, sorry, maybe reading through it quickly like this, but trust me, I just told you about a teacher you shouldn't trust. But anyway, so trust me, this is the key to this whole section. There are two kinds of teachers, and they're both bad. One declares that industry is vain. In other words, this is so hard, you can't do it, or very, very few people can do it, right? That person cuts away the root of hope. The other says, oh, man, just go for it, dude. Just go for it, you know? So what? It's great. Everybody loves Walt Whitman. Read some Walt Whitman, you know? But he raises it only to be blasted. He raises hope only to be destroyed. So these are the two types of, let's say, encouragement. Well, one is being too aware of the problems and difficulties of study, and the other is a little too encouraging, a little too praising, right? So these are the two problems that Samuel Johnson sees. So he says false hopes and false terrors are equally to be avoided, right? Don't be too afraid of things, but don't be so optimistic that you're gonna fall down at the first obstacle. Every man who proposes to grow eminent by learning should carry in his mind at once the difficulty of excellence and the force of industry. You guys can just enjoy that. And remember that same is not fame. Fame is not conferred, but as the recompense of labor. And that labor vigorously continued has not often failed of its reward. So very encouraging at the end. You do not become famous or successful unless you have worked really hard. And those who do work hard very rarely fail to get some benefit. So this is very encouraging, I think. And that's the Samuel Johnson for today. I think that took me about an hour. So there you go. That's how long it takes me to get through this essay. Sorry if I didn't use After Effects and things like that. Maybe I'll figure out ways to make these things shorter. This is just the way that I do it right now, guys. It's beautiful. It's full of surprises, and you know, a little work, you can get into these old texts and find all kinds of little treasures. You might say, well, I could have figured that out too. My grandmother used to say that stuff. Yeah, and God bless your grandmother. Let your grandmother keep saying that stuff. But here we are in another treasure house, another place where we're finding these little nuggets. And hopefully I also was able to give you some context to the 18th century and some ways of appreciating the broader social and context and the intellectual context of the 18th century a little bit. So thank you for listening, guys. And I hope to hear from you. Take care, people.